If you caught our email on Friday, you'll know how excited I am to be starting a new series with you today on the Old Testament book of Ruth, one of only 2 books in the Bible that is named after a woman. Over the next 4 Sundays, we are going to be diving into her story, learning from her life and her unwavering trust in God. At the same time, we'll also draw out some valuable lessons for ourselves as we look to grow in our faith too. Now, if you cast your minds back, you'll remember that most fairy tales begin with the famous line, "Once upon a time in a land far, far away." These familiar words remind us of long hair and a tower, the royal ball, a fairy godmother and a glass slipper, deep sleep and true love's kiss. These familiar words remind us of the classics, Rapunzel, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and many, many more. Not really my usual kind of scene, if I'm honest with you. More of an action and war films kind of guy, but each to their own. We respect that. But anyway, here is the difference. Ruth's book is nothing like that. Ruth does not begin like any of those fairy tales. So instead, get ready to enter into the land of the down and out, where dreams have been dashed and lives have been lost. This is the place where no one wants to be, and yet it is exactly where the book of Ruth starts. Maybe that's where you find yourself starting today as well. You're not where you want to be. Challenges appear. Unexpected problems arrive. Obstacles fall into our lives and upsets come our way. What I can tell you, whatever your struggles are right now, or whatever they might be one day in the future, Ruth's story is for you. So let's get straight into it and discover how God's love and providence remains even in the darkest of times, and how hope can spring up even in the most hopeless of places. The Old Testament book of Ruth, starting this week with chapter 1.
In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone, without her 2 sons or her husband. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to their homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law,
"Go back to your mother's homes,
And may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage."
Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept.
"No,"
they said,
we want to go with you to your people."
But Naomi replied,
Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me.
and again they wept together. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi.
Look,
Naomi said to her,
your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same.
but Ruth replied,
Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us.
When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival.
Is it really Naomi?
The women asked.
Don't call me Naomi.
She responded.
Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?
So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring, at the beginning of the barley harvest.
So fear, famine, death. It's not the cheeriest of starts, but I do promise it gets better. If you've got a Bible with you, keep it open on chapter 1 so you can follow along as we walk through the passage. The first thing we are told in verse 1 is that the story of Ruth is set in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. Now, if you're not familiar with that particular part of history, imagine instead that it started out with the words, "It was a miserable and stormy night," because this time has been described by some as the dark ages of Israel. You see, God's people had quite the journey in getting to this point. First, they endured a long period of slavery in Egypt. Then they wandered around the desert, staying in tents and living as nomads for 40 years. Now they were in a new land and they were citizens for the first time ever, but the transition was far from smooth. In this part of their history, we see this repetitive pattern where the Israelites kept on abandoning God. Over and over again, they seemed to forget their true identity and their heritage. In fact, the heart of the problem can be summed up with a sentence that is recorded throughout the book of Judges, the one coming just before Ruth, where the writer says, "In those days, everyone did as they saw fit." In other words, people thought, I'm not going to answer to God. I'm not going to care about other people. I make my own rules, my own truth, my own morality. I'm going to do whatever I see fit because I am my own everything. And so God, wanting to turn his people around and bring them back to their senses, would allow for them to fall into the hands of other nations. Under oppression and persecution, his people would then finally see their wrong and cry out for help. In response, God would raise up a leader, or a judge as they were called in those days, but then the pattern would soon start up again. The very moment that the Israelites had some form of relief, they then went back to their old ways, embracing false idols, pagan worship, corrupted values, and so on. It's a tragic, endless cycle that went on and on throughout that time in Israel's history. So as you can imagine, this was far from a hopeful time. It was a terrible time. But interestingly, this is precisely when the events of Ruth's book unfold. We meet a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi who lived in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. They had two sons, Mahlon and Kilian, but there is a subtle irony even here at the beginning of the text. There is a famine in the house of bread. Bethlehem is starving. So to survive, Elimelech flees with his family, which to us sounds reasonable, but here is the problem lying beneath the surface. Bethlehem was part of the famed promised land which God had promised to bless abundantly with milk and honey. During this very targeted and localized famine, the most common response from a faithful Jewish person would have been that God was unhappy. He was displeased. He was trying to get their attention because of their disobedience. Elimelech and his family would have known that from reading the Old Testament. They would have known that God caused the famine. In Leviticus 26, for example, the Lord tells his people, "If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you the seasonal rains. The land will then yield its crops, and the trees of the field will produce their fruit." The implication is that while God can provide food and resources, he also can take them away. So the proper response to the famine should have been repentance, seeking God's favor, asking for his forgiveness. This wasn't the time to panic, it was the time to have faith and to come back to God. But that isn't how Elimelech responds. He abandons the promised land, and of all destinations, he chooses to take his family to Moab. Now again, that may not seem like a big deal to us, but at that point, Moab was the last place that God's people should be going. Their history was dark, and they were enemies of Israel. The author of Ruth spares us from the details, but the people of the day certainly would have known this city was evil. To give you an idea, it started from an incestuous relationship with a daughter who got her father drunk to have a baby, and she named him Moab. We read that in Genesis chapter 19. From there, pagan worship, wild living, and all kinds of immorality became common practice in this city. In fact, in the book of Judges, Moab even invaded Israel and ruled over the people for 18 long years. So this place should have been a despised and awful place in the minds of God's chosen nation. And yet we find this contrasting, sad portrait of Elimelech. No loyalty to God, no loyalty to the promised land, no loyalty to his fellow Jews. Crisis came, and the moment it did, he turned his back and went running towards an enemy city. The sad irony in all this is that Elimelech's name means "my God is king." But here is a man who did not trust his God. He abandons his home to survive, but the opposite happens. He passes away. We don't know how or why, but ultimately, in the end, Naomi is left as a widow with her 2 sons. And here we can pause and take real pity on Naomi because she had fallen into a serious situation. Being a widow was often seen as a position of disgrace. In those days, a woman's worth was tied up to her husband. Without them, they were left in poverty. They were vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Many were forced into prostitution to try and make a living. That is why there are so many Bible verses, particularly in the Old Testament, about protecting and caring for widows, because the ancient Near Eastern culture was so heartless towards them. But when it came to Naomi, even this tragic option of prostitution wasn't a possibility. She was too elderly. She was a foreigner in an evil land. No prospects of care or support, a victim not only of death, but also of what was now her life. It's hard to imagine a more tragic turn of events for any woman until we read the next few verses. Her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, decide to marry 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Now this in itself was shameful. Her boys were expressly turning their back on their Jewish heritage, showing us that they hadn't learned much from their father's choices and that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Fast forward 10 years and we find that neither wife is able to bear children and that tragedy strikes again. Mahlon and Chilion, whose names ironically mean sick and dying, also pass away. So for this family, it's like a never-ending cycle of poor decisions, sorrow, and loss. We are left with 3 women, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, all widows with absolutely nothing of their own. No homes, no husbands, no sons, no protection. They probably all felt cursed because everything seemed to have been taken away from them. So where do they go next? Well, Naomi hears that God has been faithful and that the famine in Israel has come to an end, and so she wants to go back to Bethlehem. She doesn't really have a choice. In that society, a woman's entire life depended on having a male figure around her. She was too old to have more children of her own, and so she was essentially giving up and planning to live out her days in a place that at the least was familiar. Now, Ruth and Orpah, Naomi's daughters-in-law, are devoted to her, and they want to go as well. It creates a really bittersweet moment. On the one hand, you have Naomi, with selfless love, trying to convince them to stay in Moab, where they will have a better chance at life. Even though it means that she'll be alone and that there will be no one to care for her, Naomi blesses Ruth and Orpah and says, "Go and do what is best for you. Go back and stay in Moab with your families. Be free from me. You can remarry and find safety again, and so go and have the life which you deserve." Ruth and Orpah cling to Naomi, refusing to leave, but she insists, pushing them back once again. She cannot offer them sons to marry. She is a burden, and she reminds them that she has nothing left to offer. And so it's a sad scene. They weep together and say goodbye, or at least Orpah does. Here it's interesting once again to look into the meaning of names. Orpah means the back of neck. Perhaps that is the last thing which Naomi saw as her daughter-in-law left her. But then we have Ruth, whose name means friendly and companion, and she becomes just that. This is the first occasion where we get a glimpse into what kind of person she is. And in response to Naomi's suggestion, she offers what have become some of the most famous words of commitment and loyalty. They are often read at weddings, reflected on at funerals, all kinds of places where there is friendship and loyalty and love. Ruth says in verses 16 to 17, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." You see, Ruth was so sincere, so loving, that Naomi had no choice but to accept her. Even though she was free to start again, even though it surely meant never marrying at all because she was a Moabite, Ruth still chooses to stay with Naomi. But if we look closer into her words, we can see that this is deeper than family ties. Remember that 10 years had passed between the arrival of Elimelech, his sons, and their marriage. Somehow, during that period with Naomi as her mother-in-law and perhaps alongside her Jewish husband too, Ruth discovered faith and came to trust in God. In her commitment to Naomi, she says, "Your God will be my God." The Hebrew tells us that she uses the God of Israel's personal name, Yahweh. She is placing him above all other false gods that were worshipped in Moab, her homeland. And so her loyalty is not just to Naomi. She has also fallen in love with God and wants to be with his people, living in his land, no matter the cost. And so the two head off together, burdened by all of their sadness, poverty, and singleness. Ruth offers a glimmer of hope. Naomi is yet to see it. In verses 19 to 21, as they arrive in Bethlehem, the people recognize Naomi with excitement, but her response is telling of her heart. She no longer wants to be called by her name, which means sweet and pleasant, but rather, and in her own words, she says, "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has called me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?" Speaking straight from her heart, just like Job and many other writers in the Bible, Naomi says, "Life has been so tough and hard for me. So don't associate me with anything sweet or pleasant anymore. Call me bitter, because that's how I feel." Now, I wonder how you respond to that. I wonder what your first gut reaction is when you hear her words. Because people tend to look at it in two different ways. Some might say what Naomi is doing is wrong. Ephesians 4, for example, tells us to get rid of all bitterness. Hebrews 12 says, "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you." Naomi is being bitter. She's making false accusations about God, and we know that he isn't an evil, vindictive, revenge-seeking creator like she's making him out to be. So on one level, she is definitely in the wrong. But at the same time, let's be fair and say we can't help but sympathize with her. We can recognize her humanity and probably see ourselves in her too. Because if we are honest, we will confess, no matter our theology, no matter how much we love God, there are times when we end up blaming him for our struggles. In this particular season of her life, Naomi isn't keeping up appearances or wearing a mask or putting up a facade. She doesn't speak with a polished, clean Christian language saying, I may have endured great loss, but still, all glory to God. She is totally honest with her community. And she tells them, I have lost everything. I'm bitter. I'm upset. I miss my husband. I miss my sons. My life is without purpose. I have lost all my hope. So don't call me Naomi, because I have endured such loss and great tragedy. Her words are raw. They are real. And while they are perhaps flawed, they are something which many of us can relate to. And so as we come to an end, what can we learn from a story that so far has been quite sad and hopeless? Just one brief thought for now. When we look at all the responses of all those involved in this chapter, we discover an important lesson about trusting in God. Perhaps it is with a harsh lens, but if we look closely at the decisions of Elimelech, Naomi, and their family, we see that their challenges came as soon as they fled from God. They decided to leave the promised land and drifted away, at least momentarily, from their faith. Instead of trusting in God's presence and provision in what were difficult times, they took matters into their own hands and ended up running into a nightmare. They went to a place where they never should have been. Everything went south in the worst possible way. Death and tragedy struck, and now they're in poverty, facing huge consequences for their actions. Compare that with the Israelites who stayed at home during the famine. They recognized their mistakes. They kept their belief in God, and as their crops grew, they found out once again, as they had done throughout their history, that God is faithful. We can fairly assume that their level of trust became greater, and they all became closer to God from the experience. For us, there are enough stories in the Bible to remind us that life doesn't tend to go well for those who abandon God. Jonah is a classic example. He doesn't want to obey God, and so he sets sail, going away as far as he can, and we all know what happens next. God always responds graciously and with compassion, and this isn't to say that similar events will happen to us if we turn away. I'm sure none of us will be eaten by a big fish at any point, but it does remind us our choices have consequences. Perhaps you are facing a situation where your trust is being stretched, and you're tempted to turn away from God. Maybe it feels easier to take matters into your own hands because your patience has run out and you want to see change happening now. Naturally, our first instincts can be to rely on our own resources, our own thinking, our own way of escape, no matter what that might involve. But the challenge of this chapter is for us to deepen our trust and ask instead, what is it that God wants me to do at this moment? How can I honor him? How might this be a test of my faith or an opportunity for me to grow closer to him? Shifting our mindset in this way helps us transform our thinking and keep God as the focus of our lives rather than blaming him as the one who is responsible for all of our struggles. It's a lesson which Naomi must have learned after all she went through, and it remains true for us today as well. The safest place we can ever be is at the center of God's will. Let me say it once more. The safest place we can ever be is right in the center of God's will. Trying to handle things on our own is never a good idea. God always has our best interests at heart, and we experience that the most when we align ourselves with his will, when we step into his design for our lives. Is that always easy? Not at all. I don't imagine for a moment that the Israelites who endured the famine found it easy at any point. But is it best? Most definitely. Our challenge is to trust in God no matter what, and to believe that he will always come through, because we know that he is faithful and that he will make it all worthwhile for us in the end. That is the note upon which the chapter ends. It seems to finish on a sad tone. You have Naomi and Ruth returning to Bethlehem with little hope, and their circumstances look desperate. Maybe you're just like them and you're running low on hope as well. But in the midst of our hopelessness, do we still have reason to trust in God? Do we still have reason to believe? What I would say is, don't let the start of this story fool you. Because even though all looks hopeless, doesn't mean that all hope has gone. Listen to the words of verse 22 once again. They, being Naomi and Ruth, arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, what does that mean? It means that hope is on the horizon. The famine is over. God's providential hand and kindness and blessing has arrived. It's a whole new season in Israel. As we will go on to see, it's a new season for Naomi and Ruth. And perhaps very soon, a new season of life is coming for you too.